UFC Vegas 101 betting show. We have 13 fights this Saturday. We're back after a month-long break, and I couldn't be more excited to be here. So for the first time this year, I'm Jon Kelly. Let's hear the picks. And we're going to kick things off with Narulo Aliev, a minus 500 favorite. The comeback on Joe Solecki is plus 380. And we'll start on the Aliev side. This guy fought on the Contender Series a couple seasons ago. He was, for my money, one of the better prospects on that season. And we saw him come out in his UFC debut and beat Rafael Alves back in February of 2023. Now, the reason we haven't seen him fight for so long, he's coming off nearly a 2-year-long layoff, is because he was scheduled to fight in the later half of 2023, and he actually had to have knee surgery. I'm not 100% sure on what exactly the injury was. I believe it was a full ACL tear, and that's why we've seen him off for so long. I'm not 100% sure, so please fact check me in the comments if I'm wrong, but I believe it was a long absence due to that knee surgery. He was booked against Yanal Ashmouz, who had to pull out of this fight, and now we have Joe Solecki coming in on just a week's notice to face Aliev here. So pretty fun matchup. You can definitely expect to see a lot of grappling in this fight, and I think Aliev is such a massive favorite here because he has that typical Dagestani level of wrestling and grappling. That is his game plan. He's going to look to shoot takedowns, bank some control time. Now he's facing someone in Joe Solecki who's a very slick submission grappler, holds a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Most of his wins have come by submission, but the story is out on Joe Solecki. This dude has basically two things that you have to worry about. One, he's going to pull guillotine at nearly every opportunity. Anything to initiate grappling exchanges, he is going to pull guillotine. We saw him come really close to cashing that big round one submission prop against Grant Dawson his last time out, and that's an angle that I pretty much blindly bet on guys like Joe Solecki, Derek Minner, any of these like early sub or bust guys where books are probably going to hang a big number on them because they're such a big underdog, but pretty much their only path to victory is an early submission. And I see this in a similar light because Joe Solecki likely has to pull off that early guillotine or somehow find his way to the back in an exchange and slip in that rear naked choke. Those are basically the only two ways I could see him winning this fight, because outside of that, I think Aliev is going to land takedowns. He's got smothering top control, and we've seen Solecki, when he's on his back, that slick submission grappling is somewhat neutralized, especially when you're somebody that knows how to operate in dominant position like a guy like Narulo Aliev. So there's some concerns with the long layoff coming off surgery, but this is a pretty favorable stylistic matchup for him as long as he can stay safe early and Solecki doesn't pull off an early submission. So we'll say it's Aliev by decision. That's the official pick. And next fight up, we have Fatima Kline, a minus 800 favorite. The comeback on Victoria Dudakova is plus 550. And realistically, I do not see a single advantage for Dudakova in this matchup. I struggle to see a path to victory for her here because this is a matchup where Fatima Kline just has her covered in every single area. Kline made her UFC debut last time out against Jasmine Jasudavicius. That was up a weight class on short notice, and she gave a pretty good account of herself, but the physicality of Jasmine was just a little bit too much for her to overcome. Now she's coming back down to her natural weight class, the weight class where I do think she can make some noise in this division. She's got excellent wrestling for a female. She's one of the best wrestlers in the division for my money. She also has excellent cardio. She tends to get better as the fight goes on. Her striking is solid. She showed that off against Jasudavicius as well, and she's able to keep up that pace for 15 minutes. Now, Dudakova is basically like a lesser version of a grappler and really doesn't have any striking threat really whatsoever. So this is one where I think Dudakova is outclassed on the feet, and we've seen her against grapplers lesser than that of Fatima Kline really get outpositioned and outclassed on the mat, and I think that's what's going to happen here. I'd expect Kline to beat her on the feet, to land takedowns whenever she wants to, and really just post a top time clinic here. So this is all Fatima Kline here. She's a big favorite, but I think it's warranted. We'll say it's Kline by decision. That's the official pick. Which brings us to our next fight up, as we have Magomed Gadzhi taking on Bruno Lopes. Currently, we have Gadzhi a minus 225 favorite. The comeback on Lopes is plus 185. And this is actually my first bet of the card. I have 2 units on Bruno Lopes at plus 200. That line is still available using the best prices tool on fightnumbers.com. You could see Bet365 still has that plus 200 available. I encourage you guys to always shop around to get the best price across the market. The easiest way to do that is at fightnumbers.com. In terms of the matchup, Gadzhi Asulov's a guy previously fought on Contender Series, which you guys know is a theme of this card. We have very recent Contender Series fighters both making their UFC debut or their follow-up performance. So this is a heavy Contender Series card. You guys know I love my Contender Series prospects, and I actually thought Gadzhi Asulov, coming into his Contender Series 2 seasons ago, I thought he could be kind of interesting. You know, he hadn't really been tested against really anybody on the regional scene, but it seemed like the skill set was certainly there. You know, a guy that moves well for his size, has powerful leg kicks, and has that typical Dagestan grappling as well, can land takedowns, control his opponents, but he has a bunch of knockouts as well. Now he goes and makes his UFC debut back at UFC Saudi Arabia against Brenson Ribeiro, and honestly, I thought he looked terrible. I parlayed him on that card, I think with the over in the Whitaker fight. I can't remember. I think the other leg of it lost. But anyway, Gadzhi Asulov, parlaying him as a big favorite in that spot against Ribeiro did not feel great. Watching that fight, like, I honestly thought it was a pretty substantial, underwhelming performance for Gadzhi Asulov, not only because the striking that we saw against the low-level regional talent wasn't really there. I don't know if it was UFC jitters, if he struggled with the length a little bit of Brenson Ribeiro, who's very long for the division, but he wasn't really putting his kicks out there. He got hurt on the feet to a leg kick pretty early in that fight as well. He was really reactive to that leg kick. Now, he was able to secure those takedowns, and Ribeiro did get tired, and then he just kind of laid on him, so he did get the win. But honestly, I thought it was a pretty poor performance, and I think the jury's still out on him. This is a guy that has not faced much in terms of his level of competition, and even though he has that Yasulov like type of last name, I think that's always going to get a little bit more market respect than at times it probably deserves. And I think this is one of those spots, because on the flip side, Bruno Lopes, also a Contender Series prospect, he also fought Brenson Ribeiro a couple seasons ago on Contender Series, and you guys remember this because he got knocked out as a big favorite. He was one of the biggest favorites on that card. Now, from a market perspective, what's interesting is that he was a much bigger favorite against Ribeiro than Gadzhi Asulov was, and I'll get to more on that later. Now, Bruno Lopes came back on Contender Series this past season, fought Mikel Sanziniani, who was that Georgian power striker. He did drop him in the first round in that fight, but then Lopes, got his feet under him, kind of took over. Sanziniani just ended up gassing, and he ends up getting the round 2 finish. But Lopes, one thing that he does very well, you can watch it up and down his tape, he throws heavy leg kicks, and that's something that I think Gadzhi Asulov is going to struggle with over the course of his career. We saw that in his UFC debut. I think we could see that again. I also think Lopes is just the better pure boxer of the two. In terms of the striking, Gadzhi Asulov, he has those powerful leg kicks, but the hands, we really haven't seen it, especially against better boxers as he starts to face better competition. I think Lopes is the better boxer. I think he's got more power in his hands as well. And Lopes also has the ability to land takedowns. You saw against Ribeiro was kind of hossing him around in that first round in some of those grappling exchanges. Bruno Lopes is a big guy. He has a solid ground game, and he holds a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as well. He earned his black belt at the end of 2023. So this is a guy that is well-versed in multiple areas. He's arguably one of the best fighters, if not the best fighter, that Gadzhi Asulov has faced in his career. And I just think the market's respecting Gadzhi Asulov a little bit too much here, and I don't think it's warranted. So I like Bruno Lopes here. I think he could not only make this competitive, but I think he could potentially hurt Gadzhi Asulov. I think he can make Gadzhi Asulov work a lot harder than the market is expecting for some of these takedowns. I think for Gadzhi Asulov to cover this price, it's basically saying like he's going to land 3 or 4 takedowns and really just blanket Lopes on the mat. but he's going to have to prove it to me. I'm on the dog here. Bruno Lopes plus 200. I say Lopes gets it done by TKO. That's the official pick. And next up, we have Ernesta Kareckaite, a minus 270 favorite. The comeback on Nicole Caliari is plus 220. And this is another Contender Series matchup. Kareckaite previously fought on Contender Series 2 seasons ago. She fought Carly Judas, and they actually broke the record for most strikes landed in that division. It was an absolute back and forth war, 180 or something significant strikes, absurd volume numbers. And then she made her UFC debut against Dion Barbosa, and she ended up losing that fight, but I thought she gave a pretty good account of herself, ended up being a competitive fight there, and she was a pretty sizable underdog. Well, now she's a pretty sizable favorite against Caliari, who just fought on this past season of Contender Series, won by first round submission against a French grappler. Now, Caliari is only a purple belt. She seems to have pretty solid grappling. She's very good at reversing positions on the mat, but she also has decent striking as well. Her base is Muay Thai. She's a Muay Thai striker, so I think she's comfortable in multiple areas here. Now, the issue is, I don't really know what her game plan is going to be. You would think that she'd try to implement some of that wrestling and grappling against the longer frame of Kareckaite. She can get under those hips, land takedowns, and maybe have a grappling edge. I just think the volume is going to be a little bit too much for her. Kareckaite is very long. She throws a ton of volume. I think it's going to be a competitive fight, but unless Caliari's able to have some grappling success, which I'm pretty unsure about at this point, then I think she ends up losing a decision. So we'll say it's Kareckaite by decision. That's the official pick. Next up, we have Jacoby Smith, a minus 355 favorite. The comeback on Preston Parsons is plus 280. And Jacoby Smith is my guy. You know, this is another Contender Series guy. He was one of the best prospects, I think, on this past season of the Contender Series. And you see why, because he not only has the power in his hands, most of his wins have actually come by knockout, but he comes from a very high level wrestling background. This is, you know, you see a lot of these fighters, they're maybe an All-American or a high school state champion, and then they don't really do much in college, or maybe they at the All-American level in college, some of them. But Jacoby Smith has done that at every single level. He was a high school state champion. He ended up being an All-American in NJCAA, and then he went on to wrestle at Oklahoma State, where he was a Division I All-American wrestler as well. So I say that to show you that this is a very high-level wrestler, very athletic. His cardio seems to check out as well. Previously fought over in Fury FC, and I mentioned the hands, so it's a guy that can beat you in multiple areas, and I think that's going to be some of the advantages he has against Preston Parsons, who is really just a lesser version of that. A guy that likes to go to his wrestling and his grappling, averages over 3 takedowns per 15 minutes, but usually loses control in some of those spots. His wrestling is not super high level. His control's not great either. And his striking, he's just more of a plotter. He's very slow in terms of this division, and he's kind of a punching bag. He lacks defense. He's been hurt before as well. So this is one where, yes, it's short notice. You have Smith replacing Gustafsson, another Contender Series guy, on just a week's notice. But I think it's a favorable matchup. I think Smith has been in the gym. He's been preparing to make his UFC debut at some point in the near future. I think he's going to be ready for this test, and I think it's a good stylistic matchup for him. I think he could hurt Parsons on the feet or really just out-wrestle him at will on the mat. So this is going to be Smith for me. Smith by TKO. That's the official pick. Next fight up, we have Thiago Moises, a minus 192 favorite. The comeback on Trey Ogden is plus 160. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this matchup. Quite frankly, it's not a fight that really excites me. And I think it's one that the market kind of has pegged pretty accurately, because Thiago Moises, not only has the market been very efficient when pricing him as a favorite, he's been priced as the betting favorite and closed as the betting favorite, I should say, 6 times in his UFC career. He's won 5 of those times, with the only loss being against Joel Alvarez. And I think seeing him priced in the minus 200 range is about where it should be against Trey Ogden, because this is one where Thiago Moises, very good grappler, pretty well-rounded, durable, striking's okay, doesn't have a ton of volume, not really going to hurt you on the feet. But on the flip side, Trey Ogden is kind of a similar version of that. He's a very high fight IQ fighter, but typically needs to have grappling success. He can land takedowns, control his opponents, but those are typically guys that can't defend takedowns and can't grapple. In this matchup. I think he's going to be the lesser of the two in those areas. Neither guy's a very good wrestler, but I'm pretty confident saying that Moises is the better submission grappler. I think Moises could even threaten Trey Ogden on the mat at times. We've seen Trey Ogden against better grapplers put himself in some bad spots. He's actually been submitted multiple times in his career, even though we haven't seen that lately. And it's just one where I struggle to see where Ogden wins this. If I don't see him have grappling success, you say maybe he can outpoint Moises on the feet for 15 minutes. I guess that's possible. I just think Moises is a little bit more assertive, both in the striking and the grappling, and I think he gets the job done here. We'll say it's Moises by decision. That's the official pick. Next fight up, we have Marco Tulio, a minus 500 favorite. The comeback on Ihor Potieria is plus 380. And we'll start on the Tulio side. This is another Contender Series prospect making his UFC debut. He actually fought twice on the Contender Series. 2 seasons ago, he fought Belgarui and ended up coming through as an underdog in that spot. Did not get the contract. They brought him back this past season, gave him a squash matchup, and he ended up getting a highlight reel finish, and now he's in the UFC. Now he's making his UFC debut, and I talked about this in my betting trends thread during the break. It's on my Twitter timeline if you go back a week or so. Dana White Contender Series favorites minus 400 or greater in their UFC debut over the last 3 years are 17-2 straight up, with about a 5% betting ROI in return, and Tulio fits that trend here. I think it's clearly a squash matchup, and I think the UFC knows what they're doing here. He's getting a very favorable matchup to get a finish against Ihor Potieria, who quite frankly is not very good. This is a guy that fought on Contender Series a couple years ago and just hasn't really panned out in the UFC. His striking, not very great. Defensively, certainly flawed. He's going to get hit. He's going to get tagged. And his gas tank has never been good. That's the story on him, is you get out of the first round, typically he's going to fade. He really only had one performance where his cardio ended up holding up and he looked a lot better than some people expected, myself included. But outside of that, which was kind of an anomaly, his gas tank has never been good, his defense has never been good, and his defensive grappling is not good either. So this is one that I think Marco Tulio is going to have advantages both on the feet as the more powerful striker and on the mat as well. This guy has a solid ground game. He trains at Shoot to Box with Charles Oliveira. He has multiple submission victories on his record. I think if he pursues that path against Potieria, that's going to be a pretty sizable edge for him in this matchup. We'll say it's Tulio by submission. That's the official pick, but realistically, he wins this fight however he wants it on Saturday. Next fight up, we have Jose Johnson, a minus 180 favorite. The comeback on Felipe Bunes is plus 150. And we'll start on the Johnson side. He's coming off a loss against Asu Almabayev, but that was always going to be a very difficult matchup for him, because what Johnson does is he gives up takedowns fairly easily, but he's confident in his scrambling and defensive grappling ability to where he can scramble out of bad positions and beat his opponents on the mat as well as on the feet. And that wasn't going to happen against somebody as well versed on the ground as Almabayev, who has that smothering control game. Bunes, not really that same style of grappler. This guy on the feet is going to be throwing a lot of spinning attacks. He's very sloppy on the feet. I would expect Jose Johnson to be a little bit more cleaner in the striking exchanges. But I also think Bunes, who we know is likely to initiate some grappling here, maybe he can land takedowns because, like I said, Johnson doesn't really defend them well. But I think Johnson will actually be the one beating him to those positions on the mat and having some success in those scrambles. And I'd be surprised if Bunes is able to control him for extended periods or really threaten with a submission, even though Johnson does put himself in some bad spots at times. I just think this is a good bounce back opportunity for him and one that he takes advantage of. We'll say it's Johnson by decision. That's the official pick. And next fight up, we have a banger matchup between two heavy-handed southpaws as Uros Medic comes in as a minus 198 favorite. The comeback on Punahil Soriano is plus 164. And we'll start on the Medic side. This is a guy, most of his wins have come by knockout, fights out of the southpaw stance, has very powerful body kicks and head kicks, and that's something that he looks for in most of his fights. The concern with Medic is that his cardio historically has never been something that you can count on, and his defensive grappling is just quite frankly not very good at all. Even though he has been working to improve in those areas, I'm still a little bit skeptical that he's made all that much progress since coming into the UFC, but he's certainly a dangerous striker. And against Punahele Soriano, he doesn't really have to worry about the grappling all that much, because even though Soriano comes from a little bit of a wrestling background, you really don't see him go to it in most of his fights. It's clear that the game plan is to sit back and wait to land that big left hand, because most of his wins have come by knockout. That's really the game plan for Soriano, and I just don't think that he's going to be able to sustain that against Medic when he's getting blasted with these body kicks. We know Soriano has had cardio issues himself in the past, and I think those body kicks could pay dividends if the fight gets extended. So this is one where both guys kind of have cardio concerns, a little bit of grappling concerns on both sides as well, but I expect this fight to play out on the feet, and I think Medic is just going to be a little bit more active, and I think those body kicks and head kicks are probably going to be the difference. We'll say it's Medic by TKO. That's the official pick. Kicking off the main card, we have another Contender Series prospect making his UFC debut, as Austin Bashi is a minus 270 favorite. The comeback on Christian Rodriguez is plus 220. Now, initially, and I think a lot of people kind of had this same sentiment, initially looking at this line, it's like, wow, they're matching up Bashi with a legit prospect buster in Christian Rodriguez, who has derailed multiple hype trains, Raul Rosas Jr., Cameron Simon. Like, this is a tough matchup. This guy has good defensive grappling, good cardio, solid boxing. He's a good counter striker. This is a tough matchup right out of the gate for a young Contender Series grappler that's somewhat unproven. And I'm not going to say I completely did a 180 on that stance, but after looking into the matchup more, I actually do think that Bashi does pass this test. Now, I'm not laying this number on Bashi because I do think there's still questions if you're looking to bet a minus 270, questions that I don't want to pay to have answered. It's more of my argument not to bet the quote-unquote value loser if you think there's value on the underdog in Christian Rodriguez. And I'm actually less confident that there's value on Rodriguez even at this number, because you look at Christian Rodriguez over the course of his career, I said all those good things about him. Most of that was at 135 pounds. And I think that part is going to be overlooked by some people in this matchup. It's not being overlooked by the market, because that's why we see this betting line where it is. But I think that's one thing that does matter in a fight like this, because Christian Rodriguez has been able to do a lot of things against those prospects at 135 pounds. But when you see him move up to 145, I think that's where he starts to struggle a little bit. You saw the UFC debut against Jonathan Pierce. Yes, he outperformed expectations in that spot, but he also got ragdolled for the majority of that fight, got taken down 6 times, out-grappled, no doubt about it, ended up losing. And then the next time he goes up to 145 was against Isaac Dolgarian. And Dolgarian, same thing, stud wrestler, very athletic, beats him to a pulp early in that fight, ragdolls him, dominates him on the mat, and he ends up death gassing, and Rodriguez ends up getting the victory there. The last time was his last time out against Julian Erosa, where he ended up getting submitted early in the first round. Now, most of his success has come at 135, when he was able to withstand the early storm of Raul Rosas Jr., defend submissions, take over as the fight goes on. Against Cameron Simon, where he just kind of outclassed him over the course of 15 minutes. When he's looked at his best has been at the bantamweight division. When he's been at 145, I think he struggles a little bit more with the physicality. And I think somebody like Austin Bashi, who's a very high-level wrestler, now he's young, he's only 23 years old, but he comes from a high-level wrestling and grappling background, holds a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He's a guy that's going to rack up takedowns in volume. And somebody like Christian Rodriguez that is going to try to scramble back to his feet as best as he could. That just means there's going to be more and more opportunities for mat returns and takedowns. I could see Bashi landing 6, 7, even more takedowns in this fight if Rodriguez is able to work back to his feet. But eventually, I do think Bashi is good enough to be able to consolidate position and potentially even find the back and the finish as well. So I'm going to go with the young kid, Austin Bashi. We'll say it's Bashi by submission. That's the official pick. And next up, we have Roman Kopylov, a minus 270 favorite. The comeback on Chris Curtis is plus 220. And this is a fun matchup between two southpaw strikers. Neither guy's really interested in grappling. We saw Kopylov kind of show a new a wrinkle in his game his last time out where he basically leaned on that wrestling to get the job done against Cesar Almeida. I don't think that's going to be a path to victory for him here. I'd be skeptical if he even tries to go that route against Chris Curtis, who's historically very difficult to grapple. So I expect this fight to play out on the feet. It's going to be the kicks of Roman Kopylov versus the counter boxing of Chris Curtis. And I expect this to be a very competitive fight, one that I think Chris Curtis can win. And he's faced the better level of competition to this point as well. He's really only struggled against some of the better fighters in this division. So this is going to be one that I think is very thin margins on either side. And for that reason, I think there's got to be value on the plus 220 on the fighter who's faced the better level of competition, who is the better counter striker, and I think the better pure boxer as well. He's just got to mind his P's and Q's. We'll say it's Chris Curtis by decision. That's the official pick. And speaking of Cesar Almeida, he's also fighting on this card. He's a sizable favorite over Abdul Razak Alhassan, and he's a minus 270 favorite with Alhassan on the comeback at plus 220. And Alhassan is another one of those win condition type of fighters, right? Like I talked about it with Joe Solecki. When he wins, it's almost always coming by an early submission. When Alhassan wins, it's almost always coming by an early knockout. In fact, all 12 of his career wins have come by knockout. The majority of them have come inside the first round. And I think that is still clearly his win condition because despite having a black belt in judo, he doesn't really look to wrestle all that much, even though I think he could potentially land a takedown or two over Almeida. We know Almeida kind of struggles in that area, but I don't think Alhassan's going to do that. He's coming off that controversial no contest against Cody Brundage. Absolute joke. Not going to go into the details there, but deserved to get the win his last time out. And that would have been another first round knockout. I think he has to come out hot here and try to land a big shot that hurts Almeida. If he's unable to do that, we know historically his cardio is not very good and he struggles outside of that first round. If that's the case here, I think a high level striker like Almeida, who does have solid cardio, ends up cooking him over the course of 15 minutes and probably makes him end up quitting if the fight gets extended. We'll say it's Almeida by TKO. That's the official pick. Which brings us to our co-main event. Santiago Ponzinibbio is a minus 120 small favorite. The comeback on Carlston Harris is plus 100. And this is probably the fight that I think I have the least confidence on the entire card. And really because I have so many questions on both sides. Because I think both sides have some red flags in terms of the durability. Ponzinibbio has been knocked out 4 times in his career. On the flip side, Carlston Harris is coming off a first-round knockout loss against Chaos Williams, and he's been hurt multiple times in his career as well. Now, on the Ponzinibbio side, I think in his heyday, he was a better striker, fought some of the best of this division that has to offer, certainly higher level talent than Carlston Harris. But it's also clear that he's on the back end of his career, maybe getting closer to that dreaded R word. And I think this is a spot where I don't want to bank on Ponzinibbio still being close to that best version of himself, because I think the downside is more drastic where he's just a shell of himself, a lot slower, can be grappled as well. And I think Carlston Harris, at the very least, is going to be proactive in terms of the grappling. We see that in most of his fights. His striking is not good. He's very sloppy. He's reckless. And he has durability issues. So it's certainly a concern when the fight plays out at space, but I do think he could potentially have some success with the grappling. That's why I would slightly lean towards him. But again, it's not a confident read. We'll say it's Harris by decision. That's the official pick. Which brings us to our main event between Amanda Ribas and Mackenzie Dern. And this is the second time these guys have fought. And this is the second time these two have fought. They fought back in 2019, and Ribas ended up winning a pretty convincing decision. Now she's priced as a minus 205 favorite with Dern on the comeback at plus 170. And I think this is one where, there was clearly value on Amanda Ribas that first time they fought. She closed in the plus 160 range. I think this is almost like you got to flip the script now and bet on the sizable underdog in Mackenzie Dern, because this is one that I do expect to be somewhat competitive. And even though I think Amanda Ribas is still the better striker, she also has the potential to land some top time here. And even though I think that, and I would pick her to win if we were just picking winners, But I still think that there's probably value on Mackenzie Dern in the plus 180, plus 170 range because she's going to be competitive. A couple notes on that first matchup. That was the first time she came back from pregnancy. That was just months after having a baby. That was her first fight post-pregnancy. So I think there was, a lot of, reacclimating with the UFC lifestyle there. You saw she was also a little bit less toned in that fight, going back and watching the tape, than she is now. And you've also seen over the course of her career, her striking has greatly improved. She's not, a world beater in terms of the striking department now. But if you go back and watch her striking in that fight against Amanda Ribas, and you watch it in some of her most recent fights, her boxing's gotten much better. She was very sloppy in that first fight. Now, it doesn't mean that she's going to win the striking against Ribas, but I do expect her to be a little bit more competitive, and maybe that's going to open up more opportunities to get her grappling going, which she was not able to do in that first fight. So it's one where if I had to just pick a winner, like I said, I'd still lean with Ribas, but I think at this number, it's really just Dern or pass for me, and I think it's got to be Dern in the plus 180 range. So it's one that I think is a fun fight. Amanda Ribas, huge fan, have been since her UFC debut, so I'm always rooting for her. But we're betting numbers, and I think the number is pretty good on Mackenzie Dern here. So I'm probably going to be rooting against my girl Ribas in this one, although I do think the most likely outcome is that she wins a decision. We'll say it's Ribas by decision. That's the official pick. And as always, guys, fightnumbers.com has everything that you need if you're betting on the UFC this weekend. Check it out, fightnumbers.com. Appreciate you guys watching. Best of luck, and we will see you next week.